Hey, if you've got your Bibles, I want you to turn to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11, one of the greatest chapters in the Bible. We're going to continue today our series we've been calling Greater right out of the book of Hebrews. We're getting close to the end, and you can almost anticipate it as really the text just continues to ramp up for us. Before we get into that, let me just say thank you again for your prayers for my family. In case you haven't heard, my dad went to heaven this last Thursday, and man, I'm so grateful for the life and the legacy that he left my family and for lots of people. 60 years in ministry, man. I mean, this guy, he just kept going. He was working part-time, which meant for him kind of back to 40 hours a week. He was doing that till last December. And man, he finally said, okay, I'm going to really retire this time. And he has for the last few months. And I've been getting all kinds of texts and messages from people. And I got one from one of my oldest friends. We've known each other since we were about 12. We went to church together, went to high school together, went to Bible college together. We were roommates in college together for a while. And he said, I just want to remind you, it was your dad who baptized me. And he leaves a legacy. And his family and their grown kids, and now they're having kids, all believers and loving Jesus. And man, that's what I love about times like this. Even though I miss my dad, what an incredible thing to know that he is with the Lord and his life continues. His life lives on. Thank you for letting me share that, and thank you again for your prayers with him. We're going to do a funeral on Friday coming up this week up in Hutchinson, Kansas, and so I will likely not be with you next Sunday, or at least not be preaching next Sunday. And somebody walked in this morning and said, "What are you doing here?" I'm like, hey, this is my people. This is where I feel comforted and feel at home, and there's no way I would miss being here if I could. So let's jump into our text. Let me just back up a little bit. Hebrews chapter 10, we kind of left off, if you recall, where it says, since we have such a great high priest, this Jesus, who's our new and living way, right? And since we have access, since we can enter boldly into the most holy place, let us do some things. And one of the things that the text encouraged us to do there, we were in chapter 10, verse 19 and following last week. One of those things was that we ought to draw near to God in faith. We ought to hold on to the hope that we profess. In fact, we got to the very end of chapter 10, and it says there in verse 39, we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. And so we keep reading this word. In fact, we're going to read this word faith. It's used more than any other book in the Bible, at least any New Testament book in the Bible. And in this chapter, 24 times alone, the word faith, chapter 11, that it's used. And so when the writer says to us, I want you to hold on to your faith. Remember, this is difficult times for the Hebrews. This is difficult times for them because some of them are thinking about giving up the faith because they're being persecuted. Some of them know people who have lost all their possessions. We read that in chapter 10. Some of them know people who have died. Some of them have been kind of outcast by their family. Some of them have fears and concerns that something's going to happen. Some of them have said, this life is hard and temptation is hard and being a Christian's hard and it's too much and I don't want to do it anymore, or I'm thinking about giving it up. And so that's what they're doing. And the writer's saying, listen, I want you to just keep holding on to your faith. Don't let go of that. And the question is, how do we do that? How do we keep holding on to our faith? And so what the writer does in chapter 11 is gives us a greater understanding, I think, of what faith is. Because I think we throw the word around loosely. We really don't know what it means, and we use it in all kinds of contexts. And sometimes it gets used for things like, well, I have faith it's going to happen, which we really just mean I hope it's going to happen. Or we talk about our faith that we have, and we're really just talking about kind of our relationship with Jesus. And so we use the word pretty loosely to mean lots of things. What does faith mean? We're going to get a greater understanding of that. And then we're going to see in chapter 11 example after example after example of what faith looks like. We are going to see some of the heroes of the Old Testament and see how they lived out faith. So the word faith, it can be a little confusing. Faith is not having all the answers. Sometimes I think we get that impression that it means that you need to know everything, you need to be sure of everything, and it's not having all the answers. So we need to understand that. On the other hand, faith is not ignoring the facts. For some people, I think faith means for them just close your eyes and leap blindly, right? That's faith to some people. And faith is not that. It's not ignoring the facts. Here's my favorite definition. It probably has holes. It probably, has its own things that maybe aren't workable, but it's my favorite. I like it. I'm going to give it to you. You can do what you want with it. Faith is a choice we make, gathering all the information we can, but without having all the information we'd like to have. Faith is a choice we make. And it's gathering all the information that we can, but it's recognizing it's not all the information I'd like to have. It wouldn't be faith, right? If you had all the information you wanted to have about Christianity, would it take any faith to believe in Jesus? No, you would have it all figured out, and you could, just make this complete decision. On the other hand, it is having the needed information you have. There's all kinds of things that we know. The resurrection of Jesus, it's a believable thing, not because the Bible tells us, but because there are all kinds of sources that remind us that something took place and people's lives were changed. We can point to it historically. It's having the information that we need, but it's not having all the information that we would like to have. Faith is simply taking a step in the direction that the evidence is pointing. And so what chapter 11 does is it helps us to not only understand what true faith is, but it gives us a whole lot of people to follow in their footsteps, okay? So we're going to kind of take this really slow. Hebrews chapter 11, I want to read verse 1. We're going to do slow, and then we're going to jump in and kind of cruise really quickly, okay? This is a verse you need to know right here. Okay, this is one you ought to memorize, one you ought to kind of think through, one you ought to highlight in your digital Bible or underline in your real Bible. It says, "Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see." Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. So there's some important things here about this idea of faith and really what it is. There's a couple of phrases right there I want to look at. We're going to make a point out of them. There's the phrase "we hope for" and the phrase "what we do not see." We hope for something and we don't see something. So there's a future aspect here, something that's going to take place. We can't quite grasp the reality of it because it's not here yet. It's not a reality yet. And also something that we do not see, okay? So let me make point number one about what faith is in these terms. Faith operates in the environment of the not yet present or visible. Faith operates in the environment of the not yet and the not visible. That's exactly what verse 1 tells us. This is the kind of environment that we have to have faith. Honestly, that's the environment we live in, right? There's a whole lot of things that we don't know yet. There's a whole lot of things that we can't really see yet. The writer says that faith is about the not yet and the not seen. It's about the future. It's about the unknown. And the problem is that we don't like either one of those realms, do we? We want to know. We want to know what's going to happen. We want to know what it's going to look like. We want to know what's the next step. That's the frustration that we all have with God, isn't it? God, why don't you tell me? Why don't you just reveal it all? Why don't you let me know what's going to take place after this? If you'll just lay out all the steps, then in my mind, I think I'll follow it. I'm not sure we all would, but in our minds, that's what we think. If God would just lay it out, then we would do it. But the problem is that faith operates in the environment of the not yet and the not seen. We want to see. We want to experience. And the Bible says for there to be faith, there has to be some unknown, some unobserved, some unexperienced, some unseen. 2 Corinthians 5:7, the Apostle Paul says it this way, for we live by faith, not by sight. We live by faith, not by sight. Now, there's a whole lot of people that'll take that verse right there and say this is an ought to thing. This is telling Christians this is the way you ought to live. In fact, it's a lot of times people that are, kind of in that realm of saying, hey, we're just going to believe. We're just going to believe in God to do something. And so you ought to live by faith, not by sight. But that's really not what this is talking about. It's really saying that's the way followers of Jesus live. It's not an ought to thing. It's just the way that we live. In fact, earlier in that same passage in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 1, he says, for we know that the earthly tent we live in is destroyed. We have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands. But in the meantime, we groan. And so it's speaking of something that is, in the not yet terms. It's talking about something that we can't see. It hasn't happened yet. And so in the meantime, we live by faith, not by sight. In fact, in the very, very preceding verse of 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, it tells us while we are away from the Lord. Now, that doesn't mean like we're separated from Him spiritually. It means because we still live here on this earth and we're not yet with Him. And so there's the idea, again, where we can't see the Lord and we're not yet with Him. So we live by faith, not by sight. It's a contrast here. We can't see it all yet. We can't experience it all yet. So we live by faith. Back to verse 1. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. We looked at two phrases. Now I want to look at two words right there. Okay, the words are confidence and assurance. You got those pointed out right there. Underline them, circle them, highlight them, something really quick. So these two words are taken often to be subjective words. And so when we read that, it almost comes out of, I need to work on my assurance. I need to work on my confidence. How can I believe harder, stronger, deeper? Okay, I want to be more assured. That's kind of the idea. I want to be more assured of something. We tend to think of it that way. But in the original language, those words are more objective than they are subjective. And so the idea here isn't to believe harder. The idea isn't to have more faith. In fact, more than the conviction of faith, what the author is pointing to is the expression of faith. In fact, you'll see as we go through all of these examples of people that the author is going to say, now this is a person of faith. By faith, they did something. And so I'm going to word it this way, point number 2. Faith is more an active obedience than it is a passive belief. Faith is more an active obedience than it is a passive belief. So many people think of Christianity as kind of this thing that I've got to wrap my mind around it, my head around it, and I've just got to believe harder. I just need to be more convinced of everything. And if you'll just convince me, give me some more material, give me some more content. Would you please help me to understand this more so I can believe it harder? And I'll just get to this level at some point that then the faith will happen. But faith in the Bible is always more than just some kind of mental approval or some kind of intellectual assent. It is always active. It is always obedient. You're going to see that in the lives that we talk about. The author is going to say, for by faith they did something. It wasn't that they were big time believers. It was they were obedient, faithful believers. We're going to see that. In fact, look at verse 2. It says, this is what the ancients were commended for. This is what the heroes that we're going to read about. This is what the people that are of our heritage. Remember, this is written to Jewish Christians. So the people and the stories that are written here, while they're going to be briefly talked about, there is going to be a story that comes to mind to every original reader as they walk through this or as it's being told to them. There's a story that's going to come through. Some of them we're not even sure the fullness of the story. We can go back and read some of it. Some of them we're guessing about what those stories are. But faith is more an active obedience than a passive belief. So in the remaining words of this chapter, the writer encourages the readers to emulate the heroes of this faith, who on the basis of what they knew about God and His promises had the courage to move into the unknown. It says, you need to be like this. You're going to move into the unknown, the unseen, the not yet, all of those things, and we're going to see people who actively obeyed. But before we see those, he's going to give us an example of what this looks like. Verse 3, by faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. So we're just continuing that same thought about even creation itself, spoken by God. There was nothing there. There was nothing happening. It was everything was made out of nothing. What it was made of was not visible. We didn't see it happen. We weren't witnesses to creation. It is by faith that we believe that God created the world. And faith is a choice that we make, gathering all the information we can, but without having all the information that we would like to have. And so we look at things that, around us, and they help us to believe something like this. Like we look at the things of this earth, and we look at the earth and go, how odd it is that earth is the place that life can exist. But then when you start to study that and you realize that the earth is in exactly the right place and at the right angle and at the right tilt, the axis at the right tilt, and it has just the right oxygen mix, and you just go on and on and on. We gather that information. We go, with that information, it looks like there was a designer here. You look at the human body, and you look time and time again, the intricacies of the eye, the intricacies of the ear, the reproduction system. How in the world could something like the human body and then human life, the community of human life, exist without some kind of design? It helps us to believe that something that was not visible to us actually took place. You look at the incredible beauty of the animal kingdom, and you look at animals like a giraffe and the beauty of that, and how a giraffe can have the blood pressure to move blood up its neck, but can still bend over and take a drink of water, and yet it's somehow able to manage that blood flow. How could that happen? How many giraffes would have to evolve over a bazillion years for that to get just right? And so the author starts here in verse 3 and says, listen, this is something we can't see, but it's something that we have faith in. And then he goes through the list. And he says, by faith, Abel brought an offering to God. You remember the story of Cain and Abel, Genesis chapter 4. Abel brought an offering that was pleasing to God. His brother Cain didn't bring one that was pleasing to God, and Cain ends up killing Abel. But it was out of faith. He didn't know everything. In fact, we have so little about the story, we really not sure how we even judge that story. But the writer says it was by faith that he did that. This one's easier. By faith, Noah built an ark. He acted upon divine warnings about things that were not yet seen. And so it's an easy one for us to see. You've got this guy that God says, I want you to build an ark in an area that had never seen rain, and it was miles and miles and miles away from any body of water. Can you imagine the ridicule? Can you imagine the stories? Can you imagine the scoffing that they would have endured? Yet, by faith, Noah built an ark. He did something based upon a reality that he couldn't see and based upon the unseen. The writer goes on and says, yeah, by faith, Abraham obeyed and went to a strange land. If you read the story of Abraham starting in Genesis chapter 12, you read about a guy that God says, I want you to leave your homeland. I want you to leave your family, your father. I want you to leave everything, and I just want you to go. Where am I going? Oh, I'll tell you when you get there. And he obeyed. Abraham just left and he obeyed and he went to a strange land. Then later on, like by faith it says, Abraham offered his son Isaac as a sacrifice. God says, Isaac, I want you to go and take your son and you're going to make a sacrifice. And they get up to the mountain and there's no sacrifice. And we've got Isaac here. I want you to sacrifice your son. And at the last minute, God provides a alternative sacrificial offering. Abraham did it all by faith. He didn't know what was going to happen. He couldn't see ahead. Or how about this one? He says, by faith, Moses left Egypt not fearing the king's anger. So by faith, Moses goes up against the greatest man on earth, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And he says, God, hey, listen, it's not me. God's saying, let your people go. And I'm going to take them out into the wilderness. How are you going to feed them? I don't know. What are you going to do if I come after you? I don't know. And sure enough, he came after them. God provided. Sure enough, they needed to be fed. God provided. By faith, Moses left Egypt. By faith, it says, the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. They're cut. They're cut off. They're at a dead end. There's no place to go, and Pharaoh's army's behind them. And by faith, they walked through water that they shouldn't have been walking through. They walked through a place that should have been flooded, and they did it. Because faith is active obedience. It's not just us believing something. It's not just trying harder, thinking harder, hoping more. That's not what it is. It is active obedience. What makes it hard is God's probably not calling you to cross a Red Sea. God's probably not telling you to sacrifice your son or daughter. God's probably not telling you some of the same exact things that happened in the Old Testament. But does God still call us to have active obedience by faith in Him today? Absolutely. Just may look a little different, and we may come up with some more excuses of why we can't possibly do that. And so by faith, it is by faith that anybody here ever shares with someone else about Jesus. Nobody does that because they really enjoy, telling people hard things about people that they can't see or ever meet, right? It is a faith thing. God tells me to do something. I don't understand this, God, but I'm going to go ahead and be faithful to you because you say so. I'm obedient and I'm faithful even though it feels uncomfortable for me. It doesn't feel right. And we give those excuses all the time about why we don't do things that God tells us to do. And guess what? The writer would point us to the people in Hebrews chapter 11 and say, hey, if you want to see some people that needed some excuses, how about Abraham? Take your son and go up the mountain and make a sacrifice. Come up with all kinds of excuses for that, couldn't we? Or Moses. Hey, I want you to go up to Pharaoh. No. In fact, Moses made lots of excuses, didn't he, in the beginning? I can't talk. I stutter. God covered them all. God worked through all of them. God said, go do it. It's by faith. We do the things that aren't comfortable for us. It's by faith that we do things like we give money to people. We give money to churches. We give money to organizations. We give money to ministry. It's money that we probably need right now. It's money that we could use to, buy another Starbucks or whatever. It's money, but we, by faith, say God will provide for us when we do this. It's by faith that we do things that don't feel comfortable to us. Like we say, I'm going to go help with the kids in the second hour. I'm going to go, meet people. I'm going to go serve in some area. We do that by faith. That is a faith journey for us. By faith. When we are actively obedient. And so for us to say, I don't feel comfortable with it, or I don't like doing those kinds of things, or listen, if God's calling you to do something, that's exactly what faith is. That is the definition that the writer gives us of what faith is. It is doing the hard things that we really wouldn't do and that we can't see the outcome on and we can't see how it's going to work out, but we do them anyway. That is what everybody in Hebrews 11's had to deal with. Now, it gets even more interesting that when you get down to verse 32. Okay, skip all the way down there. So we've read through all kinds of things. I didn't cover them all. You go back and you read them. You read the stories if you want to. Then what happens in verse 32 is it's like the author gets ramped up and he's like, oh no, I'm about out of paper. I got to start writing faster. And he goes, and what more shall I say? I don't have time to tell the story about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, about David, about Samuel. Now some of these are some unknown people, some judges that, there's just a few verses about it. But like David, Samuel, those guys, they've got lots of chapters in the Bible. I don't have time to talk about them, but same thing. Who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Wow! Oh yeah, women received back their dead, raised to life again. Man, it's just like he just keeps going. I'm running out of room. I don't have room to write all these things. And I would give you all of this stuff. I wish I had time to give you all these things. But think about this is, and every one of those stories, each one of these Hebrew people are like, yeah, I remember that. Heard that one when I was young. Yep, read that one just the other day in my quiet time. They're reading through all these stories and it's reaffirming for them. Stay faithful. That's exactly what these people did in Hebrews. That's exactly what's going on. Now look what happens halfway through verse 38, right? We read the part where it says women received back their dead, raised to life again. People conquered things and, all kinds of amazing things. Armies, tearing up other people. There were others. Listen to the change of thinking here. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, some chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskin and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes and in the ground. See the shift that took place right here? First group of people, amazing, all these things God's doing through them, and they're, from the world's eyes, they are conquering, they are victorious. And then Paul says, oh yeah, and there were others. Sawed in two, buried alive, burned at the stake. All kinds of things that happen. And I'm looking at that and I'm like, Lord, put me in group one, right? Can I be in group one? I don't want to be in group two, right? But notice both groups of these people are people of faith. Both groups of people, the ones that did well, the ones that in this life, they look like everything came together for them. And then there's those people, it says they were destitute and they were living on animal skins and in caves. And both groups of people, the writer is setting them up as people of faith that we are to emulate. Those that were miraculously saved by God and those who were killed because of their belief. Things didn't go well for them. Some were rescued, others suffered tremendously. But all of them are giants of the faith. Faith itself doesn't necessarily mean that things turn out well for us. In fact, here's the third point I think the writer is wanting us to see about faith. Faith is based on the certainty of God and His promises, not a particular outcome. Oh, church, we have so screwed this one up right here. We've gotten this idea that faith is about everything turning out the way that we want it to turn out. And the writer says it doesn't always happen that way. It's not about a particular outcome. It's not based on the outcome of the way things happen. Listen, that's positive thinking, right? We got lots of positive thinking. In fact, there's a whole lot of positive thinking that's being taught in churches right now. You just need to hope more. You just need to be more positive. You just need to be more optimistic. That's not faith. That's not what the writer of Hebrews tells us faith is. Faith isn't positive thinking. It's not wishful thinking. It's not self-confidence. It isn't the hopeful projection of certain outcomes. That's not what faith is. Faith is based on the certainty of God and His promises no matter what the outcome is. In fact, the story of Abraham, we read right over it. I want you to go make a sacrifice on the mountain. He takes his only son Isaac, the son that God promised him. Isaac says, Father, where's the lamb we're going to sacrifice? Abraham says, God will provide. God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. That's Abraham's faith right there. He didn't know how. He didn't know how it was going to happen. He didn't know what the outcome was going to be. But he knew God. And he knew God's promises. That his son would be a part of something starting an entire new nation. And so his belief was, even if God has to raise my son up from the dead, I'm going to believe God and His promises. So we can't know God's plans. We don't know exactly the way things are going to happen, but we can base our faith on what God has told us, what He's promised us. In fact, let's quickly look at just the last two verses of Hebrews 11. He's wrapping up all these stories that he told. And he says, all of these people, they were commended for their faith. Yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. What the writer is telling all of us, the people that seem to fare well on this earth and the people that just seem to, get thrown in the ground here, that the fullness of God's kingdom is yet to come. They didn't experience it. None of us are going to experience it this side of heaven, are we? None of us. Only when Jesus returns will we experience God's perfection in this world. And until then, we have faith in the sovereignty of our loving Father and the certainty of His promises. Listen, that's what gets us through the difficult times. That's what gets us through the sickness and the cancer, and that's what gets us through the loss of a loved one like my dad this week, is that this is not the end. That we have faith in God promising us that there is something beyond this, and so we bank on that. We invest on that. We put all of our resources onto that because He has promised us something, and so we are faithful to Him. And in the meantime, we just are obedient. God, you're going to tell me to do something? I don't know if I'm the best one to do it. I'm going to do it. I don't know how to do it. It doesn't make me feel comfortable. But I believe you're calling me to do that. And I believe that it is not about the outcome. And it is not just about the belief and the conviction that I have. It is about the obedience that I show to God through faith. Father, thank you for teaching us today. Beautiful passage of Scripture reminding us to be faithful to you, to be obedient to you. And so, Father, I'm praying that you help us to do that. Would you help us to just deconstruct our ideas about what faith is, and God, just to trust you, just to go back to the honest trust that you are sovereign, and that you keep your promises, and that we're just going to be faithful to you and be obedient to you no matter what. God, that's what we want to do, and we're asking for your help in Jesus' name. Amen.